As mentioned before, it's been an extremely busy week for the crew on board the International Space Station. The Expedition 33, the Expedition 33 crew began its work week on Monday with some cleanup activities associated with the September 28th undocking and departure of the European Space Agency's Eduardo Amaldi automated transfer vehicle. That cargo ship that delivered some 7 tons of supplies and fuel and experiments to the International Space Station left the complex on the afternoon of September 28th, backed away to a distance of some 4,500 statute miles in front of the International Space Station. On Monday, the crew was busy cleaning up all of the Russian segment areas that the Eduardo Amaldi had been attached to for the period of 6 months since it arrived at the space station back on March 28th. On Tuesday, Sonny Williams and Aki Hoshide were busy with some replacement activities and some in-flight maintenance work associated with the replacement of a faulty pre-treat tank for the waste and hygiene compartment that is located in the Destiny laboratory of the International Space Station. You can see from this video Williams wearing a mask, a protective mask, as she worked not only on Monday, but for part of the day on Tuesday to bring the waste and hygiene compartment back into an operational state. One of the problems had occurred with what is called a dose pump that essentially pumps pre-treat liquid into the waste and hygiene compartment to keep it as sanitary as possible for the crew to use each and every day. That activity was not successful on Monday. A couple of spare pre-treat tanks were loaded and installed in the waste and hygiene compartment, were not activated properly, and so a new dose pump, one of the many spares that exist on the International Space Station, was installed. And on Tuesday, Williams and Hoshide were able to successfully restart the waste and hygiene compartment's pre-treat tank. It checked out fine, and the WHC, as it is known, basically one of the ship's commodes was back in action, ready to support the 3 crew members on board the International Space Station. Also on Tuesday, Williams and Hoshide had an onboard training exercise to brush up on procedures with the robotics workstation in the cupola for the upcoming arrival of the SpaceX Dragon commercial cargo craft that is scheduled to launch from the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station on Sunday evening and arrive at the International Space Station on October 10th. That robotics training session led to a debrief session that Williams and Hoshide entered into with the robotics officers here in Mission Control, and that was declared good, and the crew was declared proficient with its refresher training to support all of the robotics activities that will be associated with the arrival of Dragon for its berthing on the Earth-facing port of the Harmony module of the International Space Station following its launch. On Tuesday evening, that automated transfer vehicle, the Eduardo Amaldi that we mentioned a moment ago, was commanded by flight controllers at the European Space Agency's ATV Control Center in Toulouse, France, to deorbit from the orbit that it had been in for the past 6 months. And that series of deorbit burns that were commanded for the ATV resulted in its breakup and reentry into the Earth's atmosphere and its demise over the Pacific Ocean, where it now resides in a watery grave for that spacecraft, its work having been completed for the mission, in which it again delivered some 7 tons of supplies to the International Space Station. The next automated transfer vehicle, the Albert Einstein, is scheduled to launch from Kourou, French Guiana from the European Space Agency Arianespace launch site next April. Thursday saw a unique activity aboard the International Space Station, that being the deployment of 5 satellites in 2 sets from a deploy mechanism attached to the small fine arm of the Japanese robotic arm. These satellites, as you can see in this series of deployments, were used and developed by a series of not only Japanese but American technological disciplines, one of which was called Tech EdSat from San Jose State University. The satellites were placed on a on a slide table in the Japanese Kibo module's airlock, and then slid out into the void of space and were grappled by this deploy mechanism at the end of the small fine arm, which is attached to the Japanese robotic arm. It was then commanded in 2 sets of deployments by Aki Hoshide, working from a control panel and a laptop computer in the Kibo module. Those satellites will orbit the Earth for a protracted period of time of up to a year or so, collecting data for the various universities, corporations, and disciplines that developed those 5 satellites. All of the deployments went by the book. All the satellites reported to be in good working order. It was ironic from an historic standpoint that the deployment occurred on the 55th anniversary of the Russians' launching of Sputnik 1 on October 4th, 1957. Here you see the footage of the very first launch of an artificial satellite that changed the way the Earth views itself and inaugurated the space race between the United States and Russia that has now culminated into the international cooperation for the International Space Station that we see today. Again, that launch occurring 55 years ago on October 4th, 1957. On Friday, earlier today, the Japanese experiment module, or the Kibo's multi-purpose experiment platform attachment to the small fine arm, was slid back into the Kibo airlock, and the Canadarm2, the big arm, the robotic arm that is used for so much support activity on board the International Space Station, was reconfigured back into its normal configuration. Its work having been completed in support of the Japanese satellite deployments that occurred on Thursday. And as always, a variety of experiments ongoing all throughout the week by Sonny Williams and Aki Hoshide in the U.S. segment of the International Space Station, and by Yuri Malenchenko in the Russian segment of the Orbital Laboratory. And that's a look back at the week aboard the International Space Station for the Expedition 33 crew.